Welcome to Whiskey Lore, The Interviews. I'm Drew Hanish, the best-selling author of Whiskey Lore's Travel Guide to Experiencing Irish Whiskey. And today it is my distinct pleasure to welcome to the show a man who has brought us many great whiskeys over his 50 years in the business, starting at Hiram Walker, Burn Stewart, Inverhouse, then GlenAllachie and GlenDronach. And now he is making his impact felt at GlenAllachie. It is Master Distiller and Master Blender Billy Walker. Billy, welcome to the show.
Thanks for the invitation. Glad to be here.
It almost takes as long to talk about your credits as it does to do a whole podcast.
It's all history.
Yes. Well, let's jump in. I know you don't have a lot of time with me today, but I wanted to kind of get into a little bit of your history and talk about what you've seen in terms of changes through the years. And so you started out at Hiram Walker many years back. What first got you into the whiskey industry?
Interesting question. I studied chemistry at the University of Glasgow. So I had a decent background in terms of where I wanted to be in the whiskey industry. But essentially, I grew up in the town of Dumbarton, which, for all its weaknesses, had many merits, and it was unquestionably the spiritual home of Hiram Walker in relation to Scotch whisky. It's a very big part of the town. And while it was a major player, it was not the only whisky company in Dumbarton. J&B also had their bottling plant in the town, and there were other small companies like Newton Bond and McGavigan's, which essentially Dumbarton was a whisky town, and really in these days quite an important whisky town.
And so This is a Canadian company and family owned, I guess, still at that particular time.
Canadian company, yes. I'm not sure if they were still family owned. If they were a very, very big company to be family owned. But they had an incredible international reach in these days. Not just, of course, with their own with Canadian whiskey, but with Scotch whisky generally. I mean, Ballantine's was a very, very good blended whisky and had a huge presence in Asia, even in these days.
Did you feel like, what was your anticipation about what it was going to be like working in the whiskey industry at that time?
The industry was in a different place then, and as you alluded to, there probably was, Hiram Walker was still a family company. But there was much less consolidation in those days. There was many more privately owned companies, which in general created a different environment than exists today. Not necessarily a better one or a worse one, just a different one.
Did you, now this was a time period where single malt really wasn't something that people went out of their way to get. It was much more of right now I'm doing research into bourbon history, and this was the time period when they were doing what was called light whiskey, which was basically vodka aged in used cooperage, and that was their way of trying to compete with the vodka industry. Were you seeing things in Scotland at that time that were similar, that there was this move towards trying to really lighten up whiskey as much as you could?
No, that wasn't my experience with Hiram Walker. In these days, the industry was essentially owned by the bigger companies, Hiram Walker, and I think it was DCL was the then name of Diageo. William Grant's was what family company playing a big role. Chivas existed under the ownership of the American company, and these were big players, and these were the brands that mattered in terms of blended whisky. Single malt as a category in the sector, sure, it was strong, and it was dominated by Glenfiddich and Glenlivet and Glenmorangie, where they were big players in that area. But as a sector and a category, it had not been given the freedom, or indeed was there a demand for each of these individual malt whisky distillers to express themselves or to be allowed to express themselves. And and it's one of the great mysteries that have unravelled, thankfully, over my period of working in this industry, where single malt has become such a significant and important player in the world of whisky.
Well, and it's interesting that you would have started during this time period. I look back to somebody like Alfred Hitchcock. When he got into making movies, he started in the silent era, and that really spoke to where his talents went visually as he progressed. And you starting out in an era where blends were the most of the industry, and now we've moved into the world of single malts. How do you think all of that has kind of assisted you in taking a different approach to what you're doing with these distilleries?
It's a really good question, and there are so many factors at play in this, and you have to accept that 50 years ago the world generally as available markets were very different. In these days, first of all, we weren't in the European Union. Indeed, if the European Union existed, the Soviet countries were difficult to enter, very difficult to enter, if not impossible. And in the Far East, the big player was Japan, and a big player and a very exciting economy. The likes of South Korea, China, Vietnam, Thailand, Taiwan, indeed. All of these countries really didn't present opportunities in these days. And if you compare that today, it's amazing just how the world has become such a vibrant and relatively easy reach in terms of where Scotch whisky is today.
So, as you saw those markets coming on board, the Japanese market, were they also very heavily into blended whiskeys, or because I know they always tried to emulate what was going on in the Scotch world?
Listen, in the early days of my presence in the industry, blended whisky unquestionably was the player in Japan, and the big brands were Ballantine's and Chivas, Johnny Walker, and some of the other Hagues. Black and White was a big brand in Japan, and yes, so blended whisky had an enormous presence in Asia and indeed internationally. And the truth is, still continues to be a huge part of the whole Scotch whisky experience in these markets.
When you were at Hiram Walker, did you have any particular brands that you were appreciative of, that they were more in your that you kind of held on to them even after you left?
It's an interesting story. Ballantine's was a great brand, and surprisingly was little sold in the United Kingdom. They focused very much on the export markets. But we also had another brand called Ambassador, which was essentially targeting the Canadian market. I'm not sure if it exists today, but it was a big success and a very, very good brand. And listen, in these days, there were a lot of good blenders because the challenge was on. You couldn't allow the standards to slip. There was a very informed blended market out there, and there were no mistakes or not allowed.
So when did you actually get hands-on in terms of blending? Was it at Hiram Walker, or was that at Inverhouse?
Hiram Walker was more about an overall holistic understanding of what was going on in the industry, the process. We actually did our own yeast bubbing, so yeast manufacture, fermentation generally, both in terms of grain whisky and malt whisky. We produced the two Lowland malts here, Inverleithen and Lomond. So got to learn a lot. Learned a lot at the feet of a great blender, Jack Gowdy. maybe one of the great blenders. Very, very understated individual, operated under the radar, fantastic blender. But when I joined Inverhouse, I was given enormous freedom to experiment and indeed drill really deeply into the opportunities that could exist. And again, Inverhouse was an American company owned by Publica based in Philadelphia, and they gave enormous freedom to the individuals to go and express their talents. And on the side, we had Glenheath, the grain distillery, and we had Glenflagler, and a few derivatives of Glenflagler like Glenmavis, Killyloch. So a lot of interesting things were being made there, and they were frankly, they were a company that gave me a huge freedom to go and express how I wanted to take a lot of things forward.
Very nice. So you are kind of known now as the man who works with those sherry casks and really gets a lot of great flavors out of those sherry casks. Was this something that you were paying attention to back then, or was that going to come along later on?
Well, I think we were paying attention to the influence of woods and the various categories of wood that could deliver for you. I don't think I would say with hand on my heart that Inverhouse necessarily saw great merit in sherry casks. That came later, but Inverhouse were a great company, and they had some wonderfully exciting people working with them during the 5-6 years I was there.
And then when you went on to Burn Stewart, you actually, how involved were you with the startup of Deanston? That's an incredible distillery and just a fun place to visit and hear the story of.
Well, in fact, Deanston was an interesting story. It was owned then by Invergordon Distillers when we acquired it. And at that time, Invergordon had a number of distilleries that were mothballed. Deanston was one of them. Tullybarden was another one. So when we acquired Deanston, it was mothballed, and it required a huge amount of tender care to rehabilitate it and indeed to get the distillery going again. It had, it needed a lot of tender care, and we spent a lot of time understanding the general well-being of the site and how best we wanted to represent its personality and DNA from the distillation stage through to the quality of wood that we could see would be the right platform to allow the kind of final product we were looking for to express itself.
Do these distilleries speak to you then, or do you try to kind of push them in a direction?
I think we definitely pushed them in a direction, but when you're inheriting a mothball distillery, and it had been closed for quite some time, you're given a certain you're given a certain freedom to express where you want to be. That you can determine the heart of the cut that you want to take. You can determine how long the fermentation is going to be, and importantly, you can determine the kind of spectrum of casks that you want to engage with to create the right platform to get the final DNA that you're looking for.
And so you're still kind of working in the world of blends at that time then. So it's probably not as critical to the single malt experience, that you can still have some younger whiskeys in there and do a blend and be able to pull something in the direction that you want to pull it in.
That's a really good question, and the reality is that the real skill in blending is still in blended whiskey. And that's about creating, a formula that you use the right grain whiskies in such a way that the they don't overpower the malt whiskies you want to include in the blend, but allow them to express their freedom. So it exists as a platform that's supportive, but it shouldn't be overwhelming in in terms of masking the real beauty of the single malts that are included in the blend.
Mm. And so now it's a really interesting question about mothballed distilleries. My first experience with hearing about mothballed distilleries was when I bought a bottle of GlenDronach 15, and I was told it's probably closer to a 18-year whiskey than it is a 15-year whiskey, because if you do the math, you see that the distillery was mothballed for a certain period of time. So, is it, what are the considerations? I mean, how do you get over the hump of having this big blank space in the middle of your inventory?
I think the answer to that is with some difficulty. But you have to reflect on why these distilleries were indeed closed or mothballed for whatever period. It is interesting, just retracing our steps that Hiram Walker owned GlenDronach for a period of time when they acquired the William Teachers Group. So I was quite familiar with GlenDronach. But GlenDronach was not the only distillery that had been mothballed. When we acquired BenRiach, it also had been mothballed. And indeed, at the point of acquiring BenRiach, which was in 2004, there would have been something like 18 distilleries that were either in a kind of closed down status or a mothball status. And that kind of tells you how significant the change has been in the understanding and the success of single malt. If you compare where we are today and where we were around about the beginning of 2000, the world has changed so significantly. In the case of GlenDronach, it had been closed for 6 years. And of course, we had to find a way of smoothing the hump. And yeah, we did. And there was a bit of over-aging going on as we developed the brand. It was important that we kind of brought particular age points to the market. And in doing so, we did a bit of over-aging. But, it wasn't unusual in these days for age brands to be significantly overaged.
Mm. And so were you recasking a lot of things? Were they using ex-bourbon barrels at some point in there, or was it already being aged in sherry barrels?
Oh, it was a mix. There was a significant number of casks in sherry casks. William Teacher, the original owner of GlenDronach, were a great proponent of the use of sherry casks, and maybe one of the first companies in the market to recognise the additionality and indeed the differences that these casks could bring to the final product.
What I find interesting too is your mixing of PX and Oloroso sherry casks, because to me, I sometimes hear the complaint that PX is a little too sweet, and sometimes the Oloroso is a little bit darker for some tastes. And here you found a marriage in between. Was that something that you kind of devised on your own, or were you inspired by somebody on that?
I think there was a lot of trial and error. But it's bringing a lot of experience to the table, and understanding the nature of the base spirit. Fairly muscular spirit can handle big, rich casks, and certainly when GlenDronach came into that category, it was a fairly muscular Highland whiskey, and that gave you the opportunity to do a lot of the exciting and exciting things that we wanted to do with the brand.
I think I have heard this many times, that when you ended up selling the three, or when the three went away, GlenGlasso was the one that was probably the hardest one for you to let go of. And I love that whiskey. I laugh at the story that it kept getting mothballed because they were making too good a whiskey in there. It was too heavy bodied and it was hard to blend with. Did you blend with it prior to? Was that involved in any company that you owned at any point? And what was it that made you love that distillery?
It wasn't so much its ability to use in blends. It was our experience with GlenAllachie was more about the creative work we did when we acquired the distillery, and much of which will eventually come to the market. And my biggest disappointment was we didn't actually have ownership long enough to be part of the experience when some of these great casks eventually appear in the marketplace. And there are many great casks, and that distillery's time will come.
Mm. Are they your babies when you work on these? Because it's really interesting to see that you're at a place just long enough to kind of get things going in a direction, and then you leave there and you're kind of starting over again on some new casks. Do you get attached to some of those casks?
I think you get attached to the experience and the kind of philosophy that you wanted to build into the brand. We did a lot of work at GlenAllachie, a lot of very, very, significant amount of re-racking into different styles of casks. We had a relationship with winery in Crimea, which was the previously had been the favourite winery of the Russian royalty, and we got some really, really fantastic sherry casks for these guys. Sherry, in parenthesis, it was the Russian alternative to
Mm.
sherry. The casks were brilliant. The oak wood genus was Russian oak, which, by the way, gives a wonderful platform for the casks. Very, very thick staves, and I don't think that's been introduced to the market yet. But when it is, it'll be beautiful.
Very nice. One of the ones that I saw, I was in Edinburgh and I stopped into a pub and they had one of your GlenAllachie whiskeys there that I thought was absolutely fascinating because I'd never heard of this type of cask being used before, but it was an ex-rye cask from Koval. It was an 8-year single malt, and it was amazing. What got you interested in working with rye casks?
I think we're more interested in working with Koval, to be frank. We also got some Koval bourbon casks as well as rye casks. The fascination for rye was that, historically we are actually quite a conservative group of people within the Scotch whisky industry. And of course, by definition, within the Finance Act, we are restricted in many ways we're restricted to what we can actually do. Using rye casks it was unusual. But my fascination was that A, it was going to be different, and B, I thought it would be spicier. And the casks they were relatives. I think they were quite small casks. They weren't octaves, but
Mm.
they were smaller than conventional American barrels. And so we were fascinated, and fascinated just sucked us into let's try it. Were we disappointed? No, absolutely not disappointed. Do we continue to use them? Yes, we do continue to use them. And again, in the process of, and we pour over these casks, all the casks, on an amazingly regular basis. We're looking at 100, 200 casks every week. We are assessing exactly where they are in terms of our expectation. We have a Bible on virtually every cask that we own, and we can look and see. We had a look at this 6 months ago. what direction was it going in. So the rye casks never disappointed. We probably haven't done enough with them yet, but
Mm.
they work very well.
I have to tell you that you inspired me to do my own little at-home blend, which was taking Wild Turkey 101, which is a high rye bourbon, and mixing it with GlenDronach 12, and it actually was a really nice blend. I would never have thought of those two really working together, but they did a nice job, and it was like, oh. And then I got bold and started trying to blend other things, and they didn't work out quite so well.
That's allowed, but we at the moment we're using quite a number of James Pepper rye, and they're working out extremely well.
Very nice, very nice. So, what got you interested in GlenAllachie then? Once the three were sold.
Well, that's what really got me interested in anarchy because the the process of selling was painful for me, and it was one that I wasn't totally comfortable with. My two partners, South African partners, um, had expressed a wish to sell, and I have to say they were excellent partners. So it was appropriate that the will of the majority won the day. But in my own mind, I felt there was still some unfinished business in terms of taking an unknown, relatively unknown distillery operating under the radar, virtually no exposure to the consumer in terms of branding. What an opportunity!
Mm.
There is almost no downside to that. From a blending point of view, I was very familiar with GlenAllachie. It was a good blending whiskey. It was fairly muscular, full-bodied, and kind of attractive spirit that kind of said that could be interesting. Well, when I had a conversation with Pernod, we kind of said, well, yeah, they said, would you like to buy it? And I said, absolutely. And so we found a way to accommodate both our desires.
Very nice. Did you have when you walk into a distillery like that and you see your inventory, are you automatically then going, okay, these casks, we're gonna likely do this with these and do that with those, or do you kind of just take a long approach to it and go cask by cask?
I think we had probably decided in our mind that what the DNA of the ultimate GlenAllachie products should look like. We for sure were going to make this distillery that was recognised as being one that focused on sherry casks, but not only sherry casks. So we had in our own mind what the kind of medium and long-term plans were, how we wanted to express the DNA of the distillery through the various releases that we would bring to the market. But the first step is to go and really understand what you have in warehouse, what is the quality of the liquid, what casks are they in, what direction do we want to take them in, how much do we want to rerack, what new wood are we looking at. So that's in the bigger plan. And then we look at it's a big distillery. It's 4 million litres.
Mm.
It's way. This is not our expectation. So that's the distillery. It's based on conventional fermentation. We want to move away from that. We want long fermentation. So we reduce the distillery capacity or our production levels to around 800,000, 900,000 litres of alcohol. This allowed us to move to long fermentation of somewhere around about 140 to 160 hours. It also meant that we didn't need to operate 3 shifts 24/7. So we had a staff that was kind of essentially 7 o'clock to 4 o'clock, pretty relaxed, benign working hours. But the long fermentation was very important to us and continues to be very important. And the kind of new fill we're making on the basis of this program is amazing.
Mm. It's The more that I learn about distilling and the more that I find with the distilleries that I really like, the fermentation process to me really does take a huge part of that, getting a really nice fruity character into a whiskey. But it's probably harder to do in a distillery that has a lot of accountants around, I would imagine.
Well, thankfully we don't. And indeed, many of the decisions we make, I'm sure that our financial guru is probably appalled that we are breaking with convention. But look, long fermentation is important for many reasons. But in particular, we allow the fermentation to go full term, so it becomes a very benign wash. Um, and we then allow it to sit and allow any friendly, sympathetic bacteria to continue to operate on the broth and bring a degree of additional flavouring to the mix. And by the time we take it to the wash still, it's a much easier liquid to distill than, say, you were bringing a fermentation at 52 hours, which frankly is still fermenting at 52 hours.
Mm.
So you bring it to the wash still, and it's difficult to control, and you may get some overlipping into the neck of the still, which absolutely you don't want, because then you get the possibility of solid burn on onto the system, which creates eventually these solids will decompose and give
Mm.
you flavor contribution that is, let's say, unwelcome.
Mm. And once you've got that new make spirit, um, do you cask into bourbon automatically, or are you going straight into first fill or second fill sherry barrels? And what's that process like? Are you also do you would you rather be blending from barrels that stayed the same through their whole life in the same barrel, or do you like the recasking?
I think it's a bit of all of that. We will fill into at birth. We'll fill into sherry casks. We'll fill into fresh American barrels. We'll fill into virgin casks of various toasting levels, various channing levels, and we will monitor the development of these. But essentially, doing all of these gives us various kind of bases to look at for the future and decide how best we are going to take the various releases forward. But putting the spirit into fresh American barrels at birth doesn't disappoint.
Mm.
It's you could put them into these casks for 3, 4, 5 years, and then recask into a variety of sherry casks. An area that we are looking very closely at in terms of the lens at the moment. We're looking at Fino, Amontillado. We're looking at
Mm.
Manzanilla. We managed to get our hands on some Policatado casks, which is a very interesting sherry cask. All those in PX. We're looking at puncheons. We're looking at butts. We're looking at hogsheads, and all of these contribute to the expectation and the delivery that we get when we finally put these into the bottle.
I can't imagine how difficult it is to find these. You've really inspired a lot of people to start using sherry barrels, and now I'm seeing bourbons using sherry barrels, and I'm thinking, man, that you've actually almost done yourself a disfavor because now it's probably harder to find these barrels than ever before.
It's certainly more expensive to find them than ever before. But one of the one of the one of the great freedoms that you have as a private distillery is that you are allowed to express your kind of wildest thoughts uh, in the process of maturation. And we're doing a lot, as well as sherry casks, and we recognise that a lot of the work we do with sherry does spill over into other areas. But we're also looking at virgin oakwood. In your own North American country, we're looking at Chinkapin, Ozark, which are um, fascinating flavour contributions. But probably casks, these virgin casks, they need to be managed very carefully. They can overcook a little bit.
Yeah. Well, it was interesting to see while I was on my travels through Ireland that your name came up while I was over there as well. Apparently, you did some digging through some Cooley uh, barrels for Loch Gill Distillery, a 14-year-old Irish whiskey. It's like, okay, we don't see that these days too much.
And that was quite an interesting experience. Beautiful place, Sligo. Beautiful place. Wonderful location. Not sure about the building, but wonderful location for a distillery. But historically, I had done some work for Cooley as well when John Teeling and David Hines were involved. And look, Irish whiskey is different. It has to be handled differently, and it requires a different style of wood management. But the lads at Sligo, Ochil, they were excited and exciting. It was a whole new experience for them. Gave them a little bit of help, but boy, these guys were on the road. They knew where they were going.
There's an energy you see. Do you kind of see yourself in your early days in what's going on over there?
Sure, and they're still in the fun stage, and maybe also the anxiety stage.
Yeah. No, I was talking to Oliver and he was saying there's this citrus note that I'm getting off the top of this, and it's like that unknowing of what's going to happen when I put this in the barrel. You are not coming from any experience with the distillate coming out of a still like that.
And but that's a wonderful time in the development of both the distillery and the brand. You've virtually got a blank sheet and an open canvas to make whatever pictures you want to make.
It's great, and I feel that's what you're doing at GlenAllachie right now.
Yeah, look, I think it's an interesting period. The single malt, we're living at a time when there are single malt consumers who are absolutely well informed. Their knowledge is incredible, and they ask the right questions, and they have a very, very high expectation. Our take in life is that we know what footprint we occupy. We know who our consumer is. We supply into private independent importers who supply into private independent retailers who engage with consumers who are fascinated and interested in what is happening in the world of single malt. And indeed, when you engage in the right way, of course, these consumers, they become ambassadors for you and indeed for the sector. And it's an area, the consumer is so important. We're less concerned about the mass market. We have no great enthusiasm, and indeed we have no enthusiasm to be in multiple retailers or travel retail. We want to engage with people who push us.
Yeah, well, it's so interesting to me that there's this argument now going on. There was quite a dust up actually when on the GlenDronach 15 they had dropped their no chill filtering off of it, and it created a little uproar over that. And it feels like that was the first whiskey that I had that I really paid attention to that. And now I actually really enjoy it when I talk to whiskey fans and they're like, is that chill filtered? Is there color in that? That's become a question now, which really has to be heartening to you that people are paying that much attention to their whiskey.
No, this is great. And, also the distiller and the brand owners have got to recognize that there are different markets, and consumers have a different perception of how things unfold. we won't bottle anything under 46%, and one of the reasons is that that's a fairly stable strength to put an unchilled, unfiltered spirit into the bottle. 46 and above. So that it's unlikely you're going to experience any cold flock or warm flock. And that's quite reassuring. So it's knowing how your liquid behaves. That's how you create products that gives you A, the best, and B, the fewest problems.
Nice. So anything special we should be looking for down the road? Is there something you're working on that we should keep an eye out for?
Listen, we're working all the time. That's the interesting part of my job. Look, one thing that we are going to do and bring to the market over the next 18 months, we've been looking at taking a common platform of similar age GlenAllachie, similar base first maturation, and putting it into phenol casks, putting it into Montchiado, Manzanilla, Policatado, Oloroso, and PX under the umbrella of a sherry series. And it's absolutely fascinating. You know, we're not long into the experience, long enough in to be looking and understanding how these develop, and it's amazing. It's just, and when we bring the series to the market, our type of consumer will just love it. So that's one area. The second, absolutely different direction is since 2018 we've been running a peated campaign. And we intend to bring an interesting series to the market in July, August of this year. It won't be under the GlenAllachie brand name, but it will be under a brand name that clearly says it has been distilled at GlenAllachie. The difference is that we are operating with mainland peat, not Islay peat. So we are producing a peated style that is significantly divorced from the medicinal briny TCP style of the island. It's a sweeter style. Phenol level somewhere around about 26 to 32 ppm. We are absolutely delighted with it, and we will bring it to the market as a sherry style and also as a chinkapin style. And we'll also have a turbo style, which will be ppm of around about 80 ppm.
Okay, wow. So you're talking my language, because last time I went back to the mash tun, which is where I first discovered you through GlenAllachie. The second time I went, I had Kevin mix me up a flight of peated sherry whiskeys, because to me, if done right, it is a beautiful combination. And so I am definitely going to be looking forward to seeing what you guys come out with in terms of those.
But sherry and peat work very well. There's no question. It's a marriage of probably made in heaven. One of the interesting things about peat is, if you are a peat enthusiast, is that you don't need to be embarrassed, if you ever were, to have a relatively young statement on the bottle. This will come out as a 5-year-old or a 6-year-old. And the reason is that the whole peat experience, phenolic experience, is much more vibrant at a younger age than it is at an older age. Older age, the phenol levels tend to dissipate and degrade. Doesn't make the experience any worse. But the younger stuff gives you the whole holistic organoleptic experience with a nice bite.
And this is what conversation I had with John Campbell after he left Laphroaig. I said, what was your favorite age statement for Laphroaig? He said 8 year. Yeah. He said it's just perfect at 8 years, and why push it any further?
And by the way, a very talented young man.
Yes, absolutely. So, well, thank you so much, Billy, for taking the time today. I know we extended a little bit further beyond the allotted time. But you have so much wisdom to throw in our direction, and then really wonderful whiskeys that you create. So I'm looking forward to seeing those peated sherry whiskeys coming up in the future, and all the different types of wood types that you're working with. That's going to be a fun experiment to see.
Anyway, thank you for the invitation, and delighted that you are spreading the gospel.